All right.
Hey,
So you
recording
should be
started.
all set. You got stuff shared and you could just take it away. I'll go off camera.
All right, sounds good, Kevin. Thanks very much. All right, good evening, everybody, and morning and afternoon to folks in different parts of the world. Welcome to tonight's session. Today, we're going to talk about a beginner topic, Power BI fundamentals. How to start your report. That's something that uh, a lot of us do without really putting too much thought into it. And it's one of those things that if you do it right, setting up a new report right, it makes everything go a lot smoother. But if you go with the defaults, sometimes things don't go quite as smooth. And that's what we're hoping to address today, some tips and tricks to get a new report started right. So for today's agenda, we'll do a quick introduction for both the topic and for myself. Um, we'll go through some of the options that are available in Power BI. We'll talk about the need for a measure table, a date table. We'll talk about themes, and finally creating a template, a page to use as a template. And then time permitting, we'll talk a little bit about setting up the model view as well to make your life a little bit easier later on down the road. So quick introduction. You're starting a new Power report, and there's a bunch of default settings. And as one very famous man once said, defaults are the two sweetest words in the English language. Um, I say that in jest because, we often don't think about that when we use a piece of software. What are the default settings, and who are the default settings made for, and is it fit for the purpose that we're trying to use that for on that particular report? And how do those default settings necessarily affect us? Um, and there are some ways that those default settings could have positive and negative impacts on your reports. So if your default settings aren't correct, it may impact the capability of your Power BI report to do analysis. I should actually put the slides here. There we go. It may actually impact the capability of your report to do the analysis. And in very, very specific scenarios, it may actually impact the accuracy of the analysis you're trying to perform. It may change the relationships and et cetera, et cetera. There's also report performance. Some of those default settings are really aimed at people with zero Power BI experience, which can sometimes consume more resources than absolutely necessary. So as soon as your model gets a little bit bigger, um, you might notice a significant drag on performance. There's also developer effort. Some of those default settings are made for single table reports or two table reports, things that are relatively simple. And as soon as you add more complexity to it, add more tables, add more dimensions, add more fact tables, it begins to be a real effort for yourself as a developer to make changes and to understand what's really going on in the report itself. So what we're going to talk about tonight is what are some better settings? What are some defaults that I personally use? I don't want to call them best practices because there could be different opinions out there. But there are some settings that I personally steer away from, some default settings that I steer away from, and some that I steer towards. So tonight we're going to do a live demonstration. I'm going to actually open up a blank Power BI file, and we'll create a Power BI template from scratch. Feel free to follow along. If you have, especially if you have multiple screens, it'll be fairly easy to do. Just keep the presentation up on one screen and Power BI on the other. But if not, that's okay too. I think you'll get a lot out of it either way. And as I go, there will be little snippets of code that I mention. And rather than making everyone squint and read and type them out, I'll just copy and paste them into the chat and you can follow along there. And the PowerPoint file, I'll make the PowerPoint file available as well. Kevin and I were just going through some of the logistics behind that. If you need the PowerPoint file right away, I'll have my email posted at the end of the presentation, so feel free to email me and I can share the file right away. Otherwise, we'll have the link, everything sorted out when this presentation gets posted onto YouTube. And since this is a live demonstration, if any point along the way I say something that doesn't make sense, feel free to put your hand up and let's talk through it. Let's make sure that I'm communicating properly as we go as well. Right. So a little bit about myself. My name's Colin Choi. I am a engineer by training. I have a Bachelor of Sciences from the University of Calgary. And ever since I was but a wee lad, I've been working with Excel and learning data analysis, swimming in data really, and doing data analytics without realizing that's what I was really doing. Um, After I graduated, I joined a Fortune 500 company called Fluor Engineering, Procurement, Construction for heavy industrial facilities like refineries, power plants, mines, et cetera, et cetera. And spent 18 years there, and I like to think that I kind of grew up with Excel and really learned the craft. But somewhere along the way, I needed to unpivot a table. And for those familiar with Excel, you can it's really easy to pivot something, but really hard to unpivot something. And that's what led me to Power BI. And once I stumbled on that, there was no turning back. And so that's where I really pivoted my career after that. I left Fluor after 18 years and joined a small I say small, solar power company. They were doing $1 billion a year, small relative to a Fortune 500. Did business intelligence management there for about a year, and then moved on to a Power BI consultancy, where I really learn the craft and kind of honed a lot of the skills I developed over that period of time. And just very recently, I left my post at P3 and started my own Power BI consulting company, CTX, and that's where I am today. Focus, of course, is Power BI, but applying Power BI to construction and project management, which kind of a intersection of my two areas of expertise. All right. So with that out of the way, let's get started. We're going to open up a brand new Power BI file. I have one pulled up already. And the first thing that we're going to want to do with a new Power BI file is to go to the settings. Never use the defaults because you want to know what those defaults are and you want to change them to what suits you. So to do that, if you look at the very top left corner of your Power BI window, there's the file, and then go to the very bottom left corner and you'll see options and settings. So click on that. I don't know why but they make you kind of visit all corners of your screen to hit all these. And then you go back up to the top and you click on options. And that will get you to the options window. Now from here, what you're going to see is the options dialog, which has both a global section and a current file section. So we're not going to go too deep into how this works, but basically there are global settings that will apply to all of your reports. And then under the current file, it applies only to the specific report that you're on. So for today's presentation and for today's exercise, we're actually going to go just under the current file, and we're going to start at data load. So here, I want to draw your attention to the top three default settings. Number one, the first one is type detection. This means this option lets you choose in Power Query when you load a table in, do you want Power Query to automatically detect the column type for your data? And my recommendation here is if you're a beginner and you're not quite sure what's going on, leave that checked. But as soon as you feel more comfortable working in Power Query, I would strongly suggest unchecking that option. And the reason is that once you start working in Power Query, changing the data type actually causes, try not to get into the technical details, but it causes some inefficiencies in the way everything is handled in the background, especially if you're querying a database. So turning that off will let you control when that data change happens and make things go typically faster and smoother when you're trying to load data. So this is a performance consideration when you're checking that. But if you're a beginner, if you're new to Power BI, if none of what I said none of what I just said makes sense, keep that option checked until you feel more comfortable. The second set of options there is about relationships. Importing relationships from data sources on first load. This only works for databases that already have those relationships defined. If you're pulling something in from Excel or other sources, it won't have any impact. If you are loading something from a database, it doesn't hurt to have those suggested relationships already built in. I typically leave that unchecked, but it doesn't hurt one way or the other. The next two, though, are ones you want to pay particular attention to. Update or delete relationships when refreshing data, and auto-detect new relationships after the data is loaded. What these two do is when you are refreshing a report, if something about the data has changed or if you're pulling in a new table, this may put in relationships that you are not aware of. And the effect of that is, let's say you have this report up and running and you go back to this report 6 months down the road because something isn't working. It's awful. Sometimes it's awfully difficult to remember whether that relationship should have been there or not if these options are checked. So my personal preference is to always uncheck those bottom two, because that way I know that if a relationship is there, it was either there initially that it's intended, or I put it there myself with intention, rather than have it be something that Power BI did on my behalf without me knowing. So for that reason, I strongly suggest unchecking those last two under relationships. And the first one, even, I mostly often leave that unchecked. The third option I want to talk about on this page is time intelligence. Time intelligence is a very useful feature in Power BI, but when you check this option for auto date time, what it does is every time there's a date column in any of your tables, Power BI will create in the background and invisible to you a separate table for managing the dates. So it'll take that date, break it down to the year, quarter, month, etc. Which sounds wonderful because when you first load Power BI up, you load a single table on, it gives you the ability to do time intelligence right off the bat without any extra effort. But as your model gets more complex and you load more tables, what this does is actually creates many, many tables in the background. And as your table grows, it actually grows exponentially because of all these tables that are being created in the background without you even realizing it. And it starts to affect the performance of your model. The other impact this has is if you have multiple fact tables with dates in them, you want those dates to be related to a common dimension table so that you can do analysis on them using the same dimension, using the dates, basically comparing dates between different tables. And this option makes that more difficult. So for that reason, as soon as you move past your first Power BI report, it is strongly recommended, I strongly recommend anyway, that you uncheck the option for auto date time. So that covers data load. Now, before I move on from this first options page, are there any questions or any discussions we want to have around any of these? I'm getting a thumbs up. I don't see any hands up, so we will keep moving forward. The next page of options I want to talk about is the report settings. Specifically, I want to draw your attention to export data. There are three options here for how your users export data. Basically, it's you as the developer deciding whether you want your users to be able to download just the data that they see on the screen, or you want them to be able to access the full data set underneath a particular table or a visual, or not to allow the user to download any data at all. And those three options, it's kind of along a spectrum, which is nice. But as a developer, one of the things you need to think about is which one makes the most sense. Now, first and foremost, if your model contains sensitive data, then you need to be extra cautious with the setting that you put here, because you don't want to inadvertently expose data that's meant to be confidential or limited to a specific set of individuals. That's where security considerations come in beyond the scope of this conversation, but it's something to keep in mind. If there's sensitive data, be extra cautious here. And I would lean towards that last option. The other thing to consider is it's worth asking the users of your report what they intend to do with the downloaded data. And typically, there's two answers with folks that download the data. One is I'm going to download the data to do one-off analysis that, it's pretty hard to predict what that's going to be. I just want that available to me. That's a great use case for being able to download data. The other answer that you sometimes get is the user wants to download the data and run an analysis that they run every quarter, every month, or every week. And they're going to do the same analysis over and over and over. And that's where you want to ask those questions to unearth those situations, because that's where you, as the Power BI developer, can say, if you are just doing repetitive analysis anyway, why don't we put that into the Power BI file, save you those steps, save you time, which is the whole purpose of Power BI to begin with. So this, and I know this is fairly early on in the life cycle of a Power BI report, but that is a fairly necessary conversation. And by the way, just because we select one now doesn't mean we can't go back to change it later. But this does give you a reason to have that conversation with your users early on in how they're going to use that spreadsheet, or how they're going to use your report, and how they're going to use the data they get from the report. Generally, I go with the first option, unless there's sensitive data, in which case I tend towards the last option. Very rarely do I give permission for the users to download the underlying data. And the reason being, especially as your data set gets large, allowing the user to download underlying data means they could be potentially accessing millions of rows of data that is quite meaningless on their own, and probably too much. It'll be an overload for most users. And to be perfectly honest, an overload for Excel as well, which is probably where that data is going. Any questions about that option set? Okay. I want to talk about one more set of options before we move on, and that is the preview features.
Sorry, this Gus, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Why is export data set as default on the underlining data? I opened up my own. You said that's a bad option, but it seems to be the Microsoft default.
So it's not that exporting data is necessarily bad. It's just, what are your users planning to do with it? And it's asking the question of, is it something that can be taken care of in Power BI or not? Where I personally have run into some issues with it is when you're exporting the entire underlying data set. There is a cap for 500,000 rows on that export, but it's still a lot of data for Excel to handle. So it's not that Excel can't do it. It's just you're beginning to run into those limits, and those file sizes get awfully large in Excel anyway, and the processing time gets to be large for the user. So generally, I just recommend away from that. But having said that, being a Power BI consultant, if some clients insist on it, we turn it on, because there could be potential cases where that is absolutely necessary as well. It's just for the general user, that tends to be too much data. Did that answer your question, Godson?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. The next set of options I want to talk through is preview features. So Power BI is updated fairly frequently by Microsoft, which is a good thing. And Microsoft also has a policy of, as a new feature gets close to being finalized, they preview it to the general user population, which is great. That means we get features more quickly, and the user community has a chance to provide feedback on features before they become a final version, before they get implemented in their final form into Power BI. What this means, though, is we're effectively all beta testers, and sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's not. Sometimes we only want to use what's fully tested and reliable and vetted. This is where the preview features options comes in, and there is no right or wrong here in which options you choose to check or not to check, because it's all about your tolerance for using features that are still in preview mode, which means that those features may not be functioning perfectly, especially when a feature is first put into preview. It often happens that there are some bugs in, say, a visual or some bugs in a certain function that's in preview mode that don't quite work quite as expected and may cause crashes. As the feature matures and it's spent a long time in preview, those bugs tend to get ironed out. And then eventually, most of the features that show up in preview eventually graduate, quote unquote, to GA, generally available, where they become a full part of Power BI itself. Up until that point, though, that feature could change, it could evolve, and there may be just some bugs with it that you'll need to be tolerant of when you use those features. Having said that, I love the fact that there are features that I can access early, and I often, as you can see in this set here, I often keep a few of them checked by default because I just use those features so much. So an example here would be the new card visual, which is an update on the original card visual. The new card visual offers a lot more flexibility in formatting. It offers the ability to put in multiple pieces of information, multiple measures under one visual, which helps performance. It does a lot of great things, but because it's still under development, it's a preview. But that doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's unreliable because it's been in preview for so long that it's a great feature. So just for you to be aware of, and for you to be aware that there may be an option to access different features that you may not be aware of, or that could be very useful to what you're doing. Any questions or comments before we move on to the next session? All right, so with that said, I'm going to change the features I suggested. And we will start new Power BI report. So one of the...
I'm sorry, Colin, I got a question for you.
Yes.
Personalized visuals, have you ever used those? Do you have any opinion on those?
Personalized visuals. Yeah, let me pull up that options again. So what personalized visuals are is in the Power BI service, users have the ability, and let me just find the option here. I was looking at this a little earlier today. Down here, under report, current file, report settings, personalized visuals. What's this? Somebody has their mic on and it's causing a bit of an echo. If you wouldn't mind going on mute. So what personalized visuals is, when you upload a report into Power BI, it gives the report viewer the ability to change the visuals that you set as a developer. So that means they can change the visual type. Let's say you have a bar graph and they want to turn it into a line graph instead. The user has the option to do that. And they may also choose to replace one measure with another. So let's say you're showing dollars and they want to change out to show number of customers, for instance. It gives the user the option to do that. So Don, I think in answer to your question, for me, I kind of look at that as a more advanced features, and I really try to think about the audience, and I try to get my best sense of what the audience needs before I decide whether to turn that on or off. It's off by default because I think for a beginner audience, it presents a whole array of options that may be overwhelming. And quite frankly, if the audience is new to Power BI, they're probably going to be more comfortable downloading the data and pulling it into Excel to do further analysis anyway. So they wouldn't use that even if they had it. Even if they knew it exists, they wouldn't use it. Having said that, for a more advanced audience who's used to using filters, who's used to who understands the data model and can play with the data model a little bit, it becomes an extremely powerful feature where you basically give the audience a way to develop while they're consuming the report, which extremely powerful, but only for a very limited, very experienced audience. Beyond that, I think most, especially a beginner audience, they even if they had it, they wouldn't know what to do with it. It doesn't hurt to have it on, but then it doesn't help, which just means it increases loading time, decreases performance. You're on mute, Don.
No, sorry. Yeah, I agree. They're probably not going to notice it anyway. I found for my own reports, it's good when I have a matrix that I might want to see things in a different order in like a matrix visual, and then I can move things around and I'm not locked into that one view. But yeah, point taken. Good job. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel. Daniel, you have your hand up? If you're speaking, I'm not able to hear you.
Yeah, I see he came off mute, but yeah, I'm not able to hear him either.
Yeah.
Maybe having issues with his microphone.
Yeah. Daniel, keep trying. Just jump in whenever you get your mic working, and we'll come back to this one, to your question. All right. The next thing I want to go through is the measures table. So in Power BI, it's generally recommended to put all your measures into a single table so that you can locate them easily. And that's called a measures table. You want to do that because while it is possible to put your measures into the table that they quote unquote belong to, really in a semantic model, those measures don't have a home table. The home table that you see them in is just a location where they're displayed. By putting them to a measures table, it makes it a lot easier to find measures that are perhaps drawing their data from multiple tables. And it just gives you a quick way to find the formulas that you need to use most often. For me, anyway, that's something that I found saved me a lot of time in finding things and in helping keep me organized as I work in, as long as I build up, especially once the data model gets more complicated. So in order to create a blank or a measure table, what we're really trying to get to is a blank table with no columns and nothing but measures. So to do that, we go to the home ribbon and we click Get Data. And if you click on blank query, it's a quick way to do that. And when you click on that, you will get a Power Query editor that pops up with that blank query. Now, there are others that use the enter data option to do that, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. And hopefully the folks that have been around a while will see something a little different here that's interesting to them as well. So what I said earlier was that the object of the measure table is that you want it to have no columns in it. But I find that you actually can have some columns in this table and it's still functional. The only thing is you have to hide those columns. Now, one other table that typically gets created and then hidden immediately is a table for the refresh date stamp. So I have a habit of actually putting these two things together. So we're going to do a little bit of different exercise here. So in Power Query, first thing we're going to do is rename this table instead of query 1. We're just going to give it a name measures. And I like to start it with an underscore. That always keeps it at the front of the list, although you don't have to do that. And if you just type that and hit enter, that'll go through. And then I'm going to paste a little bit of code into our chat here. And if you put that into the formula, ooh, what's going on here? I hit the wrong button. Okay, let's try that again. So if you take the snippet of code that I just shared on the chat and you paste it into the formula bar for this measures table.
We didn't get that in the chat for some reason.
Oh, because I need to hit the send button. There
There
we go.
you go.
Okay, so if you take this little snippet of code and you paste that into your formula bar, what you get is a 1-column, 1-row table with the current time, date and time. And what this does is every time you refresh your model, this single cell will get updated with the date and time that that refresh happened. And that'll be a very useful thing to have if you want to put a date stamp on the report itself. So with that in place, you just hit close and apply, and that'll create your measure table. Now the next thing, so we're back into the Power BI view, and if you look on the right under the data panel, you will see that there is now a measures table. And there's a column, when you expand that, the refresh date stamp here is the column that was just created. Next thing we want to do, because it's bad practice to just use a column within a within your visuals, it's always good to put them into a measure first. You want to create a measure out of that. So under most of the menus here, you'll have the ability to create a new measure. I like to go to modeling and go to new measure. And now I'm going to give you a different piece of code to put in here for this first measure that we're going to write. So what this piece of code does is it just references that column and says display that column as it is. So when you paste that in and you hit enter, you see on the data panel that there is the column and the measure you created. Now, having done that, you got two items now under the measures table. There's the refresh date, which is the measure, and the refresh date stamp, which is the column. Right-click on the column, refresh date stamp, and hide it. So if we right-click on it, this menu will come up, and hide is about halfway down. And once you hide it, something funny happens. The icon beside the measures table changes from a table to a calculator. And that tells you now that Power BI recognizes that as measure table. And I'm getting a request to zoom to the top. Let's see if I remember how to do that. I am having trouble zooming right now. So, apologies to the requester. I'm actually, Zoom, it's not working for me at the moment. So what I can do, however, is click to the PowerPoint where I had a screenshot of that. So what I was referring to before is the measures started out as a table icon. And after you hide the refresh date stamp column, you right click on the column, click on hide, you get a measure icon. And that shows that Power BI recognizes that measures table as being an official measures table. The next thing that we want to do is create a date table. Now, a date table is
before you move on, can I add one sticky point on the measure table?
Absolutely.
So I still have a policy that I don't use measure tables. And it's because there used to be things that were broken once you do that. I think most of what's in Power BI has been fixed by that. But there's still one thing, if you're doing self-service and having users connect through Excel, like what Donald was talking about earlier, in Excel, you lose the ability to double click on the measure to do the drill through in Excel when it's on a measures table. It has to be on the fact table that has the data in order for that to work. So
And
just
that's
one little word of advice if you're going to do self-service and allow Excel.
okay. And that's Excel. Okay. So thank you for that. That's
Yeah.
good to know. But then I guess, Kevin, if that's the case, then if you're in Power BI service, and you're not allowing self-service, then that will not be a concern then. Is that correct?
That would be correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you're like not giving Bill access to the model and expect people to open it up in Excel, right? And then because there are some other things too that you could put. There's a property that if you open up Tabular Editor, we'll get way deep for a second, but that you could customize what that kind of DAX or what that query does in order for that drill down. So it's just, one thing to kind of think about. But most people have been using measure tables recently because they're just, like you said, just kind of in Power BI itself. The other thing that I started doing is I used the same approach that you do for measure tables, but I call it report measures for when people have thin reports that are connecting to my model. And then I ask them to put their report measures, bind it to that table only. Serves one way to easily find measures defined in the thin report. And this way, if you're never going to take that table away or change that table name, you won't break their thin report either. So that one was just recent. I just learned that. I can't remember who I got that from, but over the last couple months. So back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for those. That's good information. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is a date table. So when we were going through the options, we talked about turning off the auto date time. And with the reason being that you don't turn it off, Power BI creates date tables for you. Well, Power BI does that because that date table is necessary to allow you to slice and dice dates in different ways. For example, if you want to show everything from the month of February, you need a date table in order to get from a regular date to just February data, for instance. So since you turned off that option, what you need to do is create a date table yourself or put a date table in Power BI so that it can use that as if it was a date table. Now, the first thing I want to say is if your data is coming from a database and that database has the official, quote unquote, official date or calendar table for your company, I would strongly recommend using that because chances are, especially if it's your company, if it's done by a data engineer with input from HR and operations, chances are it'll have things like your fiscal calendar and holidays and maybe even work days, on days, off days, etc. All of that extra information that would not be available in a generic calendar table or generic date table in it. So if you have one in your database, use the provided calendar or date table because it will be richer and it'll be specific or tailored to your company's situation. If you don't have one of those, or if you're pulling your data from, let's say, an Excel file and that's not available, you need to create one. And there are two generally accepted ways of creating that. One is using DAX and one is using M. So if you use the one that uses DAX, you create that in Power BI using by creating a new table. Or if you want to use mashup, you do that in Power Query and you create the table in Power Query. So what I'm going to do is go through the one using DAX, but the one using M is just as viable. There's not like one is significantly better than the other. They're just two different ways of getting to the same answer. And for both of these options, there are many, many, many examples on the internet. For today, I'm just going to provide a very simple snippet of code for the purpose of demonstration, but these can get deep. You can get M queries that are 2,000-3,000 lines long for creating a date table. So I don't want to make light of it. It can be a very complex topic, and that generates a lot of extra analytic capability For the purpose of today, though, what I'm going to do is just provide a very, very basic date table. So I'm going to paste another snippet of code into the chat. And what I will ask everyone to do who's following along is go to the modeling ribbon at the top, click on modeling, and just below that, you'll see an icon for a new table. Click on that, and in the formula bar, you'll have, it says table equals, and just replace that with the formula that I just pasted into the chat. And when you hit enter on that, you'll create your new date table. Now, what you'll notice with the code that I have here, and I can zoom in on this one, what you'll notice with the code that I have here is I use variables to define the min year and the max year. So this is basically the year when your dates start and the year when your dates end. Jack, I see your hand up. I'll get to your question in just a second here. So you'll want to tailor this range to match what's in your data set. So in this example, I just put 2020 to 2025, but if your data set starts in 2016, for instance, and goes till the current year, you can put that date range in so that your date table is not too long. What you want to do is avoid just doing a unreasonably large range. So some people, if they're not overly versed in Power BI, they may just put in a big range so they always have everything covered. So they may put 1900 to 9999. And what they inadvertently do is by doing that, they create a date table that could be 50,000 rows or 100,000 rows tall, which affects performance. So you want to keep that narrow enough that you're not impacting performance, but tall enough that you're covering all your data. Another caveat here is if your data includes birth years of people and you don't intend on doing analysis on the birth dates of the population, you don't necessarily need to go back to the earliest birth date from all of, say, your customers. Because again, that adds 100 years worth of dates to your date table, which makes it really long and non-performant. So you typically want to stay within your fact table. And I see Fernando added a comment here. Max year is today's year plus 2, which is a very reasonable way to go about it. An option that I offer, and this is commented out in the code, which is what these 2 slashes and then what's behind it is it gives you an alternate way to define the min year and the max year, which is if you know what your fact table is and you know the date column that you're most concerned with, you could replace this 2020 with this function here, which essentially says, grab the smallest date in the relevant column in my fact table and grab the largest date in the relevant column in my fact table and have that dynamically be defined so that as your fact table changes, you don't need to go back and readjust this over time. So a perfect example is we just passed from 2024 to 2025. So this is a week old. So for the folks that decided to hard code your min and max date, they may need to go in and change that. But if you define this with your fact table, that will adjust dynamically as the years progress. And that means less maintenance for this report over time. Jack, your hand is up. What can I help?
I was curious of what would you think of a tool like Bravo for building a date table?
I'm not familiar with that tool. Would you mind? And I see Don's sharing a heart, so it must be a great tool.
Yeah, it's a tool, open source, not open source, but it's a free tool by SQL BI. And they have some very powerful utilities in there to very easily create date tables. I've used it a few times, and it works great. But I just didn't know if you had an opinion one way or the other.
Yeah, no, I don't because I've never used that tool. I know with SQL BI, downloaded their multi-thousand line date table and decided that was probably a little heavy for me. And so I always default back to just DAX because I can, the main advantage that I like is that it's dynamic to the fact table. But there's nothing wrong with a tool that will generate extra columns that you find to be useful.
Yeah, so Bravo will, like the DAX that you're showing here, will do the same thing. It'll generate a calculated column or a calculated table for the date. And then it has templates out there. You could even add your own template to it, but it has a standard template. And then for fiscal year, so like if you're trying to learn what a 445 calendar is, or a 454, or you know, those fiscal ones, it does it automatically, and it will generate the measures for you to do the work around that. So it's a great, I suggest if you download Bravo, implement it into it, just even to kind of do the learning, even if you don't use it after that. But yeah, it's a nice tool from the SQL BI guys.
Okay, I need to look into that. That sounds like a wonderful tool because I mean, my one of my previous companies had a 445 calendar, and it was it was a bit of work to get that done in DAX. But
yeah,
good to know there's a tool out there to make that easier.
Yeah, that's very common in retail, is to go with 445. And so, yeah, I used it to kind of learn how they put together, and then I rebuilt it because we're doing it in Fabric. I rebuilt it all in SQL to put a whole 445 calendar together. And also, what I did for theirs is I built all the tables so that we could do the regular calendar, the year that you would normally see, kind of like what you're kind of showing, and all the columns for fiscal. So I have tons of columns on my date table.
Yeah, there are, and I've seen date tables that are 50, 60 columns wide. And I'm sure, I mean, the SQL BI ones, I think even far more than that. But I think from that perspective, it becomes a fit for purpose discussion. So the date table is functioning as a dimension table. How wide do you want to make it? How tall do you want to make it? I think tall, like height, we've addressed, but how wide do you want to make it? And does that start impacting performance? Because your date table effectively gets merged with every other table that's acting as a fact table. So there's some considerations there as to how wide you want to make that and how much memory that will take up over time.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. But if you have the requirements that you need to do both regular calendar and fiscal, then but definitely keep it down as low as you can.
Yeah, and I think another comment on that is if you're using the downloads off the web, they'll provide many, many columns. Week of year, day of week. I find those are not as often used. Now, if you need them, by all means, keep them. But if you don't, trimming the columns you won't need is a good way to keep your report performance up. I know I've definitely had clients that said, we'll never, ever do a weekly analysis. That time frame is too small for us to be meaningful. So in those cases, I just trim the week information out of the data set altogether, out of the dimension altogether. It just keeps the model nice and slim and a little more performance over time. All right, the next piece that I want to talk about with the date table is, so we have the date table created, but we're not done with it yet. There are a couple of things you need to do to make it official. So when you create a date table, or when you load a date table for that matter, what you need to do is you need to go to the data panel on the right and right-click on date. And about halfway down this menu that comes up, there's mark as date table. And what that does is it tells Power BI, wherever it makes sense, use this table to help interpret and slice and dice dates. So when you click on that, you get this dialog box that comes up, mark as a date table, toggle to yes. And then you need to choose a column. And a well-constructed date table would typically only have one date column, but pick the column that you know is primarily referenced for the date itself, and then hit save. And now that table is marked as a date table. And you see the symbol actually changes a little bit. There's an add-on to that symbol that indicates that the table has now been designated as a date table. And we click OK from there. And now there's just one more thing we need to do before we're done with the date table. So if you go to the left side of your Power BI screen, the second icon on the left is the table view. So if you click on the table view, there's a couple of things we can do here. First is the date column. It's formatted with year, month, day, plus the time, but we know this is a date-only field, so the time is not really buying us anything. So up on top in the ribbon there is data type. You can change that to just date. And then when you make that change, you'll notice Power BI has a default date format. And then going back up to the top again, the second section of the ribbon has format. You can change that date format to whatever format you're comfortable seeing. I typically like to pick one that's nice and short for the purpose of display. It is, if you show the day of week, the month in full written out form, plus the year, that tends to take up a little too much real estate on the screen to be helpful. So I like to pick something nice and short. My personal preference is the European year, month, day. But there's also the North American month, day, year. Whatever you and your organization is most comfortable with, pick that option. And that gets you to a good format. The other thing that we need to do here is the months. Power BI by default sorts ascending numerically and alphabetically. That means with months, Power BI will sort it alphabetically unless you tell it not to. So here we need to tell it not to. So click on the month column, and at the top ribbon, do sort by column. And you want to sort it by the month number, which is the column right next to it. And that just tells Power BI whenever you see the month, instead of sorting it alphabetically, sort it by this other column, which is the number that that month represents. So that will let you do ascending and descending properly with your months. And I see Fernando here. Let's see. One good tip for beginners, always save your report. So that's a very good point. So I'm just going to hit the save button here. And I'm just going to do that as well myself. And then Vicky, just before that, asked a question, what implications does marking as date table have if you don't have auto relationships in place? I don't know.
I
Kevin,
mean, probably more just what are the implications of marking it as a date table versus just leaving it as a table?
Actually, go ahead, Kevin.
There's some time intelligence functions, and it looks for it to be marked as a date table, and it puts I think it has to do like an all filtering around it to include all the other dates, so that when you're moving back in time, you're basically removing the current scoping filter for that. So if you're using those time intelligence functions, it makes sure that the measure that you're writing with them works correctly by putting the all within the filtering.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. I always knew to do that, but I never really asked the question why. So I'm glad you had the answer on that one. All right. So the next piece that I want to make sure we cover is themes. So I'm going to just very quickly put a couple of visuals in here, just so we have something to look at while we play with some of these themes. So I'm just going to put some random data in here. And I know these visuals won't make any sense, but it's just something for us to look at for the purpose of illustrating the next part of the discussion. So one of the comments that you often see on the internet is that the Power BI default theme is really, really ugly in terms of color and in terms of just presentation. What most of those comments don't address is that Power BI actually gives you quite a few different themes to choose from. You're not stuck with their default colors. To access that, you go on the ribbon, you go to the View ribbon, and right below that, it's just like in Word or Excel. You click this drop down and you have access to a bunch of built-in themes that's available. So I can click on any of these and it will change both the color set that's available in the report, as well as some, in some cases, not all, background colors. So you can very quickly change the look of your report with these themes. Another thing that you can do is once you start looking at these themes is further down the drop down, there is the ability to customize the current theme. And by clicking on that option, you can actually look at each of these colors that's typically available in your options. And you can pick what colors by default your visuals use. And by the way, when you're here, it's not just about colors. You can also pick the font that's used, the default font size for different elements within your visual. For the visuals itself, you can choose the background color, border, etc., page, background color of the page, the background color of the background behind the page, as well as making the filter pane match your report itself so that it's not this piece that kind of is a different color from the rest of the report. So all of those options exist. For the purpose of time, I'm not going to go too deep into that, but those options are there and you can play with that quite a bit. The other thing that's here is, again, under the View themes, there's a theme gallery that you can select. And when you click on that, let's see how fast Microsoft wants to respond. But when you click on that, you're taken to a, there we are. You're taken to a lot of different themes that other people have created, and you can choose from the ones that you like the most. And I'm just going to click on the featured themes here. They're featured because others have thumbs up on them, so that means they've used them and liked them. So a lot of these themes here can be downloaded, and you can just click on any one of them and download what's called a JSON file. A JSON file is just a text file with a lot of code in it. And you can download that file, and once you have downloaded that file, I think I actually crashed my Power BI report back there. I am glad.
Good thing Fernando told you to save.
Fernando asked me to save.
He is the hero.
He is the hero. We did not lose too much, just those last visuals that I created. But for the purpose of time, we'll just skip quickly through. Once you download a theme from the theme gallery, save it somewhere you'll remember, and then you click Browse for Themes, and you'll be able to just load that JSON file, and that theme will be applied to your report. And since those, hang on a second here. Since those visuals, oh, okay, the report is back. All right, so yeah, so what you can do is I'm just going to do one of my personal themes that I've kind of developed over time. You can load a theme and really change the look of your report, really without having to change each individual element. So every table, every visual, you can define the background colors and everything else around that, and quite effortlessly change the look of your report without having to make individual adjustments, which is very, very handy. And if you don't like the theme that you're using, you can always just go back to one of the default ones. It's fairly quick to change them back and forth. Now, there is one other thing I want to talk about, which is it's not just the theme gallery, but there is a whole cottage industry of theme generators. So there are a few different websites out there that let you get very specific about what's in your theme. I'm sorry, that's not the page I was intending to display. If you just Google Power BI theme generators, you'll find many, many of them. And what they let you do is start to get very, very nitty gritty and define every element in every type of visual. So you can say for every table, I want my title to be size 8 font and this particular font type. You can get very, very specific. You can do that either with a theme generator, or you can do it by editing the JSON file directly yourself. Very, very powerful, but as a word of caution, both of those options, both the theme generator and direct editing, the JSON file, both of those are very, very time consuming because you are getting into individual elements. So you can have a lot of control, but at the cost of a lot of time. So just be aware of that before you start going down that path. If you have the time and there's a specific need to achieve a certain look, that's the way to do it. If you're pressed on time, steer well clear of that and just use a downloaded or one of the built-in themes. One other thing I want to touch on is the topic of light versus dark themes. Power BI, a lot of the defaults in Power BI were, especially around the aesthetics and the colors, were made with a light background in mind. So while it is possible to do a dark theme, what you're going to find is a lot of things don't work well with a dark theme. So for example, when I mouse over a certain row in a table, in the light theme, that row gets highlighted, which looks great. In a dark theme, that row gets highlighted in the opposite direction, which actually doesn't look great at all. So you just need to be aware that those oddities exist, and it will take quite a bit of customization to work those aesthetic oddities out so that the dark theme is pleasing. It is possible to download a dark theme from a gallery to start with so that a lot of those have been ironed out. But just be aware that going with a dark theme sometimes causes a lot of extra work that you're not intending. So my general recommendation is to go with a light theme unless there's a very specific reason not to. So for instance, I had a client that the company color was black. And so they insisted dark theme is what they wanted. So, and they were okay with spending a little bit of extra time to make that look good. So we did that. But for the most part, my default is going to be light theme. And then one other thing that I want to talk about is actually a couple of things I want to talk about. One is template page. One thing that you can do is, and I often do, and in fact I always do, is before I even start putting any visuals onto a page in Power BI, I'll create a blank one and put in a few things like your headings, the logo of the company, refresh date, things that are going to be common to every page. I put that onto a template page. And then every time I start a new page, I make copies of that. And what that does is it saves me a lot of time. Rather than copying and pasting individual elements, I just copy one page with everything already built in and laid out the way I like. So to do that, there are a few layout tools that I think are worth going over. The first one is, and a lot of these are under the View menu, the View ribbon. One that I particularly like is the grid lines. So if you turn that off, you'll notice the background is all white. And if you turn it on, and I know my screen, the resolution is quite high on my screen, so it might be hard to see, but you get the dotted grid in the background, which I find really helps me with layouts. It doesn't help everyone. In fact, some people really dislike it. So that's entirely a personal preference. And then the other option I like to keep turned on is snap to grid, which means that you're able to line up your visuals and different elements a lot more easily because they snap to each other and they snap to the grid itself, which is nice. Another tool that's nice to have is you can pick a couple of different elements and you can click the align button and you can choose to align them left, center, right, whatever the case may be. And Power BI will have them automatically line up. So that saves a whole lot of time lining things up and making things look square and just right. The other tool that I want to make sure I cover is under the view menu again, there is selection, this selection icon. And what that does is it opens up an extra panel called selection. If you have a lot of visual elements within your report, sometimes elements start covering up each other or they overlap. They're close enough that you can't click on one without clicking on the other. This is a quick way to select an individual visual without having to resort or reorder the way that your elements show up. And it is actually really easy to just drag and drop in here and decide which element would go on top and which element would go on the bottom in terms of their visual order on the page. So I find that to be a very useful tool when I'm trying to lay out, especially a busy page. One thing that has been making the rounds recently on YouTube, and I want to address, is layout elements. So a lot of folks like to create a navigation bar to help the user go from page to page to page. And I find that that's typically not necessary because within the Power BI desktop and Power BI service, navigation between pages is already covered outside of your canvas itself. So there's not really a need to create a navigation bar. What it does is it takes up real estate on the screen that could potentially be better used displaying data, having more space for your data and the analysis that you're trying to do. It is a nice visual touch, but not necessary. The other thing I want to talk about is the background image. And this one was recently featured on a Guy in a Cube video. So it's kind of gaining a little traction. And that's using Photoshop or using PowerPoint or any other layout tool to create just a background image, just a JPEG or a PNG file that you use as a background with visual elements already buried into it. I find that going about this way kind of locks you into certain layouts, which may or may not be a good thing. And I find that when I'm developing anyway, I like the ability to resize different visuals and to be able to move things around to find the best layout and the best ratio of sizes for different elements within a page. And I find that having a set background is a bit restrictive. And if you need to change anything, it becomes actually much more effort to have to go back to your graphic editing software to make those changes. So my personal recommendation is to stay away from that, although there are folks that are very knowledgeable about Power BI that stand behind that method. So different opinions to consider there. For the purpose of time, I'm not going to go through this part, but I was planning actually to just show by creating the template page, you can have a letter. And by the way, this is from a project that I actually did, which is why a lot of things are grayed out. But it just shows that if you take the time, you can have a great layout within a page, and you can spend a lot of time on it and make it look great, and then replicate that from page to page by having a template page that shows all those elements laid out in the correct order in the way that looks great. And you can replicate that fairly easily by having basically a blank page that you copy before you start the next page of your report. And then finally, the last thing I want to address in today's presentation is the model view. And this is something that's often overlooked. And it's one of those things your end users will probably never see the model view on your Power BI file. But for the developers and the folks that you're working with behind the scenes, the model view is a very powerful way to communicate exactly what the design of the model is and how it works. The best type of model, semantic model to use in Power BI is called a star schema. Without getting into details around that, that's something that's highly recommended, and really Power BI is designed around a star schema. But a lot of folks typically draw out a star schema as a star shape with your main fact table in the middle and dimensions all around. Or if you go with Power BI's default layout, you get something like what you get in the top graphic, which is kind of a jumbled mess and hard to understand. Personally, I find a great way to organize the model view is to set it up like a bus matrix, basically with all of your dimensions on top and all of your fact tables down the left side, and then any miscellaneous tables on the right side. And that creates a very neat and clean view of the relationships between all of your tables. And not only do you see the relationship lines, but it's very easy to see whether a dimension table has only the one side of a one-to-many relationship coming into it, and whether a fact table has the many side of the one-to-many relationship going into it. And that just really helps to find issues really quickly. And the other thing I like to do too is under the properties pane in the model view, there is an option called pin related fields at the top of card. I always toggle that on, which means that the fields that are in a relationship, which are typically the fields you're concerned with, it pushes those at the very top of each table so that you can find them more quickly. So that's it. That's kind of my quick and dirty look at how I like to start reports and some of the tips and tricks that I use to keep myself online and on track and working a little more efficiently and hopefully keep the report performant as well. At this point, I want to open it up to any questions. And I see I've missed a few comments along the way. So I'm going to try to go through those as we go as well. But if there's any questions, please raise your hands, please speak up, and we'll talk through any other discussion points we want to go through as a group.
Yeah, I think you did a great job. This is a good thing for people, getting started or rethinking what they're doing, right? As a refresher or anything. So any questions? Anybody want to come on and see if they could throw something at him that he can't handle? Just for fun.
Well, I see Vicky has an interesting comment. So background with logos, etc., saved as an SVG, so effector file, means that it uses a lot less resources when loading. So keeping the functional flexibility is good, but it can help with big reports. So that is a good point. If you have a lot of visual elements, that does tend to plunk a page or clutter up a page and slow down the loading time. So that is absolutely a good alternative to it. For visual elements that, and I would say for visual elements that you intend to stay static, like your header. So the logo of the company in the top left corner, a divider line, maybe something in the footer. I would absolutely agree with that 100%. And then I think other visual elements, I think that's up to you as a designer. If you always know that you're going to have a navigation field or a navigation bar or something like that to the left, or always have your filters all to the left, that could be a case where that makes a lot of sense as well. Absolutely.
Good. Any other questions? Oops, see, one just went into the chat, so I'll let you read that.
Okay. Can we set up standard files as templates like in MS Word or MS Excel as a starting point for reports? Is this available in the UI so I can just click on the template and get started? I'm not aware of one, but I also know that I tend to miss things like that. So if someone's aware, please speak up. Vicky, I see you got your hand up. Is that to jump in on this comment?
Yeah. So if you set up a PBIX file with how you want it laid out and everything, if you save it as a PBIT file, disconnects from the data, but everything else is still in there. So you could use a copy of that and then point to different data sources potentially. And it's obviously a smaller file at that point as well.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So yeah, you could set up the PBIT, so like if you did some type of an SVG or some other graphic or whatever, um, and then you could start with it. So those PBITs do exist. I don't use
Thanks
them
for that,
very
Vicky.
often either, but
Yeah, I just keep mine as a PBIX and I just save a copy of it in a separate folder so I don't accidentally overwrite it. But I find that's more than sufficient. I guess it's just like Word or Excel. You could set up a full template file, or you could just have a stub of a file that you always use to start with and just remember to copy instead of write over it. Yay.
Fernando's throwing
Fernando.
a hand grenade at you.
What's your take on self-service versus enterprise BI? So self-service versus enterprise BI. So Fernando, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So self-service as in you set up the model and the end users basically create their own thin reports on top of the model. Is that what you mean by self-service?
For the sake of discussion, let's say yes. And
Okay. And the enterprise BI is basically where you have a team that creates all the reports. And basically you're feeding the users all of the analytics as well. I think it depends on the culture of the organization and for lack of a better word, how data literate you anticipate your end users to be. If I was working at, say, a university and my end user base is a bunch of professors that are used to doing statistics and a lot of high level analysis on their data, I would be very comfortable with doing self-service. Another example that goes in the opposite direction is I helped a client set up a Power BI report to look at their on-hand inventory for a distributor. And that distributor, the folks that use that Power BI report tend to be the folks in the warehouse with the tablet. In that case, I would absolutely steer away from self-service and create those enterprise solutions that have everything, all of the metrics that I think they're going to need canned so that in the field, where they have no access to a keyboard or mouse and they're just trying to work on a tablet, that everything they need is right there. So I think it really does depend on the situation and the end use case and your user base. And I would not advocate for one over the other without first knowing how that report's being used and who's using it. I know that's kind of it depends and kind of ducks the question, but that truly is the answer I have to give because without the context, I'm very likely to give the wrong answer.
I don't
Especially
think it's
knowing my luck.
I don't think it's a one versus the other. I don't think it's an either or type of thing, right? So if you're working, even if you have a central BI team, and the key word there is team, right? You may have one person that's working on the semantic model, and you should still be implementing that all your reports are thin reports. Well, the person doing the semantic model may not be doing the reports. So therefore, if you take into account practices that help your teammates be report developers, having definitions, having things structured correctly and everything, well, then you're automatically set up for self-service when somebody from the business wants to do it. So that's how I tend to think of it. The models that I build are for the team, but intended to also get to self-service very quickly.
All right, so going down the list, and I think we got a few questions stacked up now. So
Mhm.
from Panam, how do you reuse measures from one project to another, especially time intelligence measures, etc.? Clarification here, when you say one project, I take it to mean that those projects use the same data source, so it is possible to reuse those measures. If you're using different data sources, then I think you just need to rewrite those DAX measures. Period. But I think the reuse of measures goes back to what Kevin just said, which is creating the data model and then building thin reports on top of it so that you have multiple reports that all pull off of a single semantic model, or if you need maybe more than one, but your semantic model is where those measures live. And by having those thin reports, it allows multiple users in multiple instances to use those measures, maybe in different contexts, which could be useful.
Yeah, and then Donald going from let's talk to people starting with Power BI and get them to pro development in an hour, right?
Well,
But
I know. It's an advanced thing.
let's kind of before we get there, let's cover what Vicky put in the
Okay.
chat as well, right? Because I think she has a good kind of starting point, right? Vicky says that we like to have GitHub repository with the M code and DAX code that they frequently use, and then they share it from there. So they're keeping things in a common place, and then that gives you a place to go do that copy paste from, rather than having to go find the right report or PBIX file that has it. Donald's point about Tyndall is it's one of these things. I think it's still a preview feature. So if you remember when Colin went through the preview features, you could turn on that you could save your file. First, you have to save it as what's called a PBIP format now that's been introduced, and save it into the Tyndall format. Tyndall is kind of like JSON, right? To where it's all text based. It's able to be machine consumed and human consumed. And so then, like Donald was saying, is you could copy your DAX code into that Tyndall. And then Microsoft has even announced in the future, sometime this year, they're going to put in what's called Tyndall scripting within Power BI Desktop to allow you to add things in a very common way, a very simple way, using Tyndall, the TMDL language.
Yeah.
But it is something you have to go turn on right now and save as the PBIP.
Yeah. So, and to add on to what Kevin was saying, so the nice thing about it is, like, when you save it as Tyndall, instead of one big JSON file, every table is its own file, and it's got everything in there. It's got the Power Query, it's got the measures, it's got the hidden columns, it's got the formatting. And literally, again, you've got to do a little bit of work to have it saved in the format, like Kevin said. But you could then say, oh, I got my date thing perfectly set up over here. I can copy it from here, paste it in to the other one, and voila, you reopen up your Power BI desktop, assuming you didn't, screw anything up, and you've reused that entire table, measures, hidden, everything. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean, from that perspective, I also just keep a folder with a bunch of text files in it for things that I use often, like the date table that I showed a little earlier. I have the long version of that with 50 columns that I pull from as a starting point, and then I cull the columns I don't need. So that's one example. Same with the refresh date. I never remember that formula because it's one that I use once per file, PBIX file, which doesn't happen that often. So those are things that I just save as a text file. GitHub's not a bad option either. I think that's actually a great option. Personally, I'm kind of a little bit old school that way. I like my text files.
I do the same thing, Colin. I have a Word file that has all my Power Query stuff for about almost 10 years now, I think 2015, 2016. And I just find something good, or I find an example, I paste it in there, and then hopefully I can find it later when I'm looking for it. But,
yeah, and then a bookmark folder on my browser with a whole lot of web pages. can Copilot help? I am huge with using AI.
Oh,
That is a wonderful question, Godson. Thank you for asking that. I'm already seeing Don nodding. I think Copilot, I mean, I'm ChatGPT user myself, which is essentially Copilot in the future. I I find it's actually a great way to get to help steer me towards the answer. My personal experience with that has been Copilot. It takes a lot to present your initial prompt in a way that Copilot or ChatGPT gets you the exact answer that you need. And the time that you spend writing that prompt could just be the time you spent writing the code. That's been my personal experience. Having said that, I find Copilot is a huge help in helping me debug or to help me unearth a forgotten about or a function that I didn't know about or forgot about. I think it's great for that particular use case. But the actually write the code itself, I find writing that prompt is more cumbersome than writing the code itself. I don't know if there's different opinions out there.
So when you say Copilot, which Copilot are you referring to?
I guess I'll answer first. I'm talking about just the general Bing.com Copilot or ChatGPT.com, that LLM, which
Gotcha.
is quickly turning into reasoning models. So it's getting more competent in that sense, but still doesn't have direct access to your model.
Yep. And so then there's because there's different things, because you could actually bring on Copilot within Power BI Desktop if you have access to a fabric capacity that is an F64 or above, right? And that's starting at $5,000 a month, so that's a little bit restricted for a lot of people. Yeah. There's also GitHub Copilot, which, if you haven't heard, GitHub Copilot is now free for everybody. So you can kind of use that, and it learns things from what's specifically in the GitHubs, right? And for me, that works great for SQL and for Python. I haven't used it as much for DAX. So if you have the GitHub Pro version for Windows, I haven't tested it myself. It might be able to help you out a little bit more. But you do have to kind of qualify when you say Copilot, which Copilot you're talking about, because there's many out there. So
yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, back in the Data Saturday that was in Dallas a little while ago, Ginger talked about the Copilot that's kind of replacing quick measures, and I haven't tried it myself. But from her descriptions, it was lacking, and that was a few months. That data point's a few months old, but her impression at that point was that it was lacking and not quite there. It's very good at taking an existing measure and helping you put comments around it, and documentation around it, which is very valuable in and of itself. But the actual writing of measures itself, I think, as I understand, is still a little bit lacking.
Yeah, and that's what she probably demoed, and I wasn't there for it, but she probably went into the Power BI Copilot, which you need the paid F64 or above to use. And then, there's going to be more of that as you get into the Timdo scripting and stuff like that. They'll probably embed the Power BI Copilot into that. So they're just going to keep, improving upon it. But I'm kind of like you at this point. I don't find it greatly helps me out in my Power BI development. My Copilots from GitHub for MySQL and for not MySQL, but for SQL and Python helps me out tremendously. So,
yeah, and I think Brian Julius he posts a lot on LinkedIn. He's done some experiments, and he's with various different models, and his impression is that those models, if you prompt them properly, they are in line with world-class experts as far as writing complex code, which, to be honest, a little bit scary for me as a developer. But also that it does require some very specific prompting to get to that stage. And I think it's one of those situations where you have to know how to prompt it to get there, and in order to know how to prompt it, you have to know how to write the code. So for somebody who's new to DAX or new to M, that they might not have the understanding to write those prompts today, right? And in a year from now, this may be a very, very different conversation. But today, with my testing with it, both in DAX, in M, and in PySpark, if we go a little bit further up the chain, though in all of those cases, the code that's written has bugs that need to be debugged before it works. At least that's been my personal experience.
I've been having good experience with it with PySpark.
You have or you haven't?
I have. Yeah, it's been working out pretty well. So
yeah, and I think
And
I approach from the PySpark perspective, I approach it as a complete beginner. So the perspective that I have is if I don't know anything about PySpark, can I use it to help me get started? And the answer was nope. As soon as I need to make an adjustment, I get completely lost. Which I imagine would be very much similar case for DAX. I can't do that with DAX because I can't unlearn what I already know. But I know with PySpark, I tried that and it was difficult.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, as far as Power Query for Copilot, I've been pretty successful, and I'm getting very loose with my prompts. I just talk to it like I ask a person. I don't give it a lot of context, and it does pretty good most of the time. Occasionally, it hallucinates a function that doesn't exist in Power Query. Like rename but most of the time it's close enough, and like Kevin says, it gets me in the neighborhood where I can figure it out.
Yeah,
and for free,
and with
I'm not feeling bad.
Yeah, the P3, the Raw Data podcast in P3 with Rob Colley and Justin Manhart, they did an interesting experiment I think it was about 2-3 months ago now, where they basically had Rob, who's an M expert because he helped make Power BI, and Justin, who's also Power BI expert, but tied his hands behind his back and said, I will only talk to it as a non-data person and get Power Query to try to replicate what Rob was able to write, and using his knowledge. And they were able to get to different paths to get to the same endpoint, but they got to the same endpoint, which I thought was fascinating and does show the possibilities of that. And what Justin did was he actually specifically made a point of not feeding any technical information. He only gave what observational information, like I gave you this data and this part is wrong, this result is wrong, and this is how it's wrong, but without describing the process that he would personally take to fix it. And after a few tries, the model was able to get there. So
yeah, and that's
another
it's
interesting
like
data point.
iterative thing. As long as it can, you can tell it, hey, that's not right. Learn from the mistakes. I mean, that'll get it pretty far.
Yeah, and I think with reasoning models like 4.0 and the ones that are coming down the pipe, it's going to get there. Or 0.1, sorry, not 4.0. It's well on its way to getting to that point.
All right. Well, I think we're about at a good point that we should probably start wrapping up.
Yeah, I did have a comment. I guess actually on the slide here, I see you use the term bus matrix there. I was just curious where you heard that from.
Is he going to make me say it, Kevin?
Yeah, he's going to make you say it.
I heard it from other people I work with. No.
It's a Kimball thing, of course.
It's a Kimball thing.
I'll say it for you. But and honestly, I can say I've never used one, and I should probably. I feel very guilty. I can't find the link, by the way. I know a guy did something where you could take your Power BI report and build a bus matrix visual with like checkboxes or something in it. I'll have to go dig that up. It's kind of cool.
We did that in a data dictionary, and Chris had it in his Data Gods data dictionary. I just used it today, actually, for documenting a model.
So,
yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I built that into, it was like that whole thing started out as a different set of community contributions, and I contributed building the bus matrix into that.
Cool. Yeah.
So,
I
all right,
mean,
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so that just wraps up.